I wanted to make money. I was very aggressive on the street. I brought some new things into the family, hadn't been done before. So I devised a scheme to defraud the government. At one point in time, we were bringing in $7, $8, $9, $10 million a week. I had 300 guys under me ready to do anything I tell them to do.
Prohibition is the golden age of bathtub gin and speakeasies. The Mafia must have been rubbing their hands together with glee, finally a chance to shine. They were like the Robin Hoods of booze, except instead of giving to the poor, they were making a killing off the illegal hooch. But when Prohibition ended, did the Mafia throw in the towel and say, well, that was fun while it lasted? Nope, not a chance. These guys were like cockroaches after a nuclear blast. They survived and they thrived. So how did they do it? How did they keep the moonshine money rolling in? Find out in this video. Prohibition Underworld. After the repeal of Prohibition, the Mafia faced a significant challenge. Their most lucrative source of income had dried up, leaving them in need of new avenues to maintain their illicit operations. And so, they turned their attention to the world of casino-style gambling. As the United States began to recover from the depths of the Great Depression, tourism started to flourish. This presented a golden opportunity for the Mafia to capitalize on the desires and vices of wealthy tourists and locals alike. One key figure in this endeavor was Meyer Lansky, a cunning and influential member of the Mafia. Lansky, along with his partners, saw the potential in establishing seasonal gambling joints on the outskirts of major cities and tourist hotspots. Locations such as Broward County, just outside Miami, and Saratoga, known for its horse racing season, became hotspots for these illicit activities. The Mafia saw these establishments as a way to fleece unsuspecting gamblers and rake in massive profits. These seasonal gambling joints were carefully designed to attract the wealthy and the thrill seekers. Lavish casinos were constructed, complete with opulent interiors, extravagant entertainment, and a wide array of gambling options. From poker to slot machines, these establishments offered something for every gambler's taste. But the Mafia's involvement in casino-style gambling went beyond just providing a venue for gamblers. They also controlled the operations behind the scenes, ensuring that the odds were always in their favor. The games were rigged, the dealers were in their pockets, and the house always came out on top. To maintain their control over these gambling establishments, the Mafia employed a combination of intimidation and bribery. They made sure that anyone who posed a threat to their operations was swiftly dealt with. Law enforcement officials, politicians, and even rival gangsters were either bought off or eliminated, ensuring that the Mafia's grip on the gambling industry remained unchallenged. But it wasn't just the Mafia who benefited from these illicit casinos. Local law enforcement and government officials turned a blind eye to their operations in exchange for a share of the profits. The Mafia's influence reached far and wide, infiltrating every level of society and corrupting those in power. The allure of these casinos was irresistible to many. Wealthy tourists flocked to these gambling joints, hoping to strike it rich or simply indulge in the thrill of the game. The Mafia knew how to cater to their desires, offering luxurious accommodations, fine dining, and top-notch entertainment. These establishments became the playgrounds of the rich and famous, where fortunes were won and lost in the blink of an eye. But the Mafia's involvement in casino-style gambling wasn't limited to these seasonal establishments. They also had a hand in the underground gambling dens that thrived in urban markets, particularly in places like Harlem. These dens operated similarly to the old number rackets, with patrons placing bets on the daily number lotteries. Despite the lousy customer service and low payoffs, these operations remained profitable for the Mafia. They knew that even with the odds stacked against them, people would continue to flock to these dens in the hopes of hitting the jackpot, and the Mafia was more than happy to take their money. Prostitution had always been a lucrative business for organized crime, even during the days of Prohibition. But with the repeal of the ban on alcohol, Lucky Luciano saw an opportunity to further capitalize on this illicit trade. Luciano set out to establish a vast prostitution network that would span across the United States. He knew that the demand for sexual services would never wane, and he intended to exploit it to the fullest. Under Luciano's leadership, the Mafia began to exert control over brothels, escort services, and street prostitution. They recruited young women, often through coercion or manipulation, and forced them into a life of sexual servitude. These women were treated as commodities, bought and sold by the Mafia for their own profit. To protect their interests, the Mafia employed enforcers who would ensure that the women remained under their control. These enforcers were ruthless and violent, using intimidation and physical force to keep the women in line. Any attempts to escape or defy the Mafia's authority were met with severe consequences. The Mafia's involvement in prostitution extended beyond just the control of the women. They also also exerted influence over law enforcement and government officials to ensure that their operations went undisturbed. Bribes and payoffs were common, allowing the Mafia to operate with impunity. The end of Prohibition also marked a turning point for the demand for narcotics. It presented a golden opportunity for the Mafia to capitalize on. With their extensive networks and connections, the Mafia quickly established a stronghold in the illicit drug trade. They became the middlemen, facilitating the distribution of drugs such as cocaine, heroin, and marijuana to eager consumers. The profits were staggering, and the risks only added to the allure for these daring criminals. One of the key figures in this shift to the narcotics trade was none other than Lucky Luciano. Luciano saw the potential in this new venture. He understood that the demand for drugs was skyrocketing, and he wasted no time in seizing the opportunity. Under Luciano's leadership, the Mafia began importing drugs from various parts of the world, particularly from countries in South America and Asia. They established intricate smuggling routes, using a network of contacts and corrupt officials to ensure the safe passage of their illicit cargo. The Mafia's involvement in the narcotics trade was not without its challenges. Law enforcement agencies were cracking down on drug trafficking, and rival gangs were vying for control of the lucrative market. But the Mafia, with their ruthless tactics and determination, managed to stay one step ahead. To protect their interests and maintain control, the Mafia resorted to violence and intimidation. They eliminated rival gang members and corrupted law enforcement officials. They instilled fear in anyone who dared to challenge their dominance. This reign of terror allowed them to solidify their position in the narcotics trade and ensure their continued profitability. However, the Mafia's involvement in the drug trade went beyond distribution. They also delved into the production and manufacturing of drugs, further expanding their empire. Secret laboratories were set up in hidden locations where chemists employed by the Mafia worked tirelessly to produce high-quality narcotics. These drugs would then be distributed through a vast network of dealers and street-level operatives, reaching every corner of the country. The Mafia's ability to control the entire supply chain, from production to distribution, gave them a significant advantage. The profits from the narcotics trade were staggering, surpassing even the riches they had amassed during Prohibition. The Mafia's adaptability and willingness to embrace new opportunities allowed them to not only survive but thrive in the face of adversity. While some criminals turned to the risky narcotics trade, others found a different path to continue their operations: a legal loophole. One family in particular stands out for its ingenious approach to maintaining its illicit empire: the Seagram family. The Seagram family had been involved in the alcohol business for decades, but it was during Prohibition that they truly made their mark. In 1857, the Waterloo Distillery was founded in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. Joseph E. Seagram became a partner in 1869 and eventually became the sole owner in 1883, renaming the company Joseph E. Seagram & Sons. Fast forward to the 1920s, when Prohibition was in full swing in the United States. Samuel Bronfman and his brothers, driven by the lucrative opportunities presented by the ban on alcohol, founded Distillers Corporation Limited in Montreal. This new venture enjoyed substantial growth, thanks in part to the demand for bootlegged alcohol in the neighboring United States. But the Seagram family's involvement in the alcohol business didn't stop at the Canadian border. In 1923, they made a bold move that would solidify their place in history. They purchased the Greenbrier Distillery in the United States, dismantled it, and shipped it to Canada. The distillery was reassembled in LaSalle, Quebec, allowing the Seagram family to produce alcohol legally. With their legal operations in Canada, the Seagram family found a clever way to continue supplying alcohol to the United States. They exploited a legal loophole by shipping their product to Newfoundland, a French-controlled overseas collectivity off the Dominion of Newfoundland. From there, bootleggers would smuggle the liquor to Rum Rose in states like New York and New Jersey, where it would be distributed to eager consumers. This strategic move allowed the Seagram family to bypass the middlemen and directly supply the bootleggers. By cutting out unnecessary intermediaries, they maximized their profits and maintained control over the distribution process. It was a brilliant display of adaptability and ingenuity, showcasing the lengths to which organized crime would go to keep their illicit operations running smoothly. But the Seagram family's involvement in the alcohol business didn't end with Prohibition. They were prepared for the eventual repeal of the ban in 1933. While other bootleggers were left with obsolete operations, the Seagram family had stockpiled a substantial amount of aged whiskeys ready to be sold in the newly opened American market. Their foresight and careful planning paid off handsomely, as they were able to capitalize on the sudden surge surge in legal alcohol sales. It's worth noting that while Samuel Bronfman's dealings with bootleggers during Prohibition have been extensively researched, he was never convicted of any criminal activity. Various historians have documented his connections to the underworld, shedding light on the intricate web of relationships between legitimate businesses and organized crime during this time. However, the Seagram family's journey wasn't without its challenges. In the 1930s, when they established their business in the United States, they faced the consequences of their actions during Prohibition. To settle delinquent excise taxes on liquor illegally exported to the U.S., they paid a fine of $1.5 million to the U.S. government. It's worth noting that the government had initially demanded a staggering $60 million, highlighting the scale of the illegal activities that took place during Prohibition. The Seagram family's ability to adapt and exploit legal loopholes allowed them to transition from the illegal alcohol trade to a legitimate operation seamlessly. The pre-Prohibition and Prohibition era. Before Prohibition came into effect in 1920, criminal gangs in large American cities operated on the fringes of society. These gangs were part of a social hierarchy, with political bosses financing their control of votes through payments from criminals involved in gambling, prostitution, and bribery. However, it was the local gangs, consisting of various ethnic groups, that focused on street-level crimes and activities that would lay the foundation for the rise of organized crime during Prohibition. In cities like New York and Kansas City, the Sicilian Mafia, comprised of immigrants from southern Italy, made money through the notorious Black Hand racket. This involved sending cryptic letters to fellow Italians, demanding payments under the threat of violence or death. The Mafia's activities were not limited to extortion, as they also dabbled in gambling and other illicit activities sanctioned by the infamous Tammany Hall political machine. However, it was not just the Mafia that thrived in the pre-Prohibition era. Various ethnic groups, such as the Irish, Jewish, and Polish, had their own local gangs involved in a range of criminal activities. These gangs operated in their respective neighborhoods, engaging in extortion, loan sharking, drugs, burglary, robbery, and contract violence. The Irish gangs, like the infamous 5 Points Gang, were known for their involvement in street-level crimes. They operated in the notorious 5 Points neighborhood of New York City, engaging in activities such as pickpocketing, street brawls, and protection rackets. These gangs were often involved in clashes with rival groups, leading to violent confrontations on the streets. The Jewish gangs, on the other hand, had their stronghold in neighborhoods like the Lower East Side of New York City. These gangs, such as the Eastman Gang and the Yiddish Black Hand, were involved in various criminal activities, including extortion, gambling, and smuggling. They operated in close-knit communities, using their connections and influence to control their territories. The Polish gangs, like the Market Street Gang in Chicago, were known for their involvement in organized crime. They operated in neighborhoods with large Polish populations, engaging in activities such as bootlegging, prostitution, and protection rackets. These gangs often clashed with rival groups, leading to violent turf wars and power struggles. It is important to note that these criminal activities were not coordinated under a centralized organization. Terms such as organized crime and syndicate would not enter popular use until after Prohibition began. However, the groundwork was being laid for the transformation that would occur during the Prohibition era. Prohibition, which began in 1920, provided members of small-time street gangs with the greatest opportunity they had ever seen. The demand for alcohol was high, and organized racketeers quickly seized control of the illegal bootlegging industry, as well as the urban political machines and vice operations. They understood the intricacies of legitimate businesses and were willing to bribe anyone to ensure their operations ran smoothly. By the early 1920s, the profits from the illegal production and trafficking of liquor were staggering. Gangsters became more organized than ever, employing lawyers, accountants, brewmasters, boat captains, truckers, and warehousemen. They even hired armed thugs known as torpedoes to intimidate, injure, bomb, or kill their competitors. These criminals were not just involved in the production and distribution of alcohol, they were also skilled in the art of bribery. Organized racketeers understood that to operate successfully, they needed to have the right connections. They bribed policemen, judges, juries, witnesses, politicians, and even federal prohibition agents. These bribes were seen as the cost of doing business, ensuring that law enforcement turned a blind eye to their illegal activities. With their connections and financial resources, these organized racketeers dominated the illegal bootlegging industry. They bought closed breweries that had shut down due to Prohibition and hired experienced brewers to produce high-quality alcohol alcohol. They ran boats out into oceans and lakes to buy liquor from Great Britain and Canada, leading to the term rum running. They even paid individual citizens to operate stills at home, producing gallons of bad-tasting booze. The illegal alcohol was then sold through a vast network of mob-owned illegal bars known as speakeasies. These establishments, hidden behind unmarked doors or disguised as legitimate businesses, served as secret gathering places for those who wanted to enjoy a drink during Prohibition. To ensure the safety of their operations, bouncers would often look through peepholes in the front doors, screening customers before allowing them entry. The profits from these illegal activities were staggering. The new alcohol trafficking gangs during Prohibition crossed ethnic lines, with Italians, Irish, Jews, and Poles working together. However, inter-gang rivalries, shootings, bombings, and killings were prevalent during the 1920s and early 30s. More than 1,000 people were killed in New York alone in mob clashes during Prohibition. The period sparked a revolution in organized crime, generating frameworks and stacks of cash for major crime families that, though far less powerful, still exist to this day. The infamous Italian-American five families of New York, including the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo families, would emerge from the wealth produced by Prohibition. Bootleggers operated across the United States, from Boston to St. Louis, Miami to Seattle, and San Francisco. In Detroit, the Notorious Purple Gang smuggled liquor across the Detroit River. In Cleveland, Mo Dallitz's Mayfield Road Gang used speedboats to transport liquor across Lake Erie from Canada. However, the largest syndicates born out of Prohibition were based in New York and Chicago, both port cities with considerable populations of downtrodden immigrants from Italy, Ireland, Poland, and other parts of Europe. Many of these mobsters were part of a generation born in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, coming of age with Prohibition. They saw the immense profits that could be made from the illegal alcohol trade and seized the opportunity. The rise of organized crime during this time was fueled by the insatiable demand for alcohol and the willingness of these criminals to exploit it. In the criminal underworld of the Prohibition era, two key figures emerged as the faces of organized crime: Charles "Lucky" Luciano and Al Capone. These notorious gangsters would come to symbolize the power, wealth, and ruthlessness of the mob during this time. Charles "Lucky" Luciano, an Italian immigrant from Sicily, began his journey into organized crime at a young age. At the outset of Prohibition, Luciano, just 23 years old, started working for illegal gambling boss Arnold Rothstein, a major investor in bootlegging. Under Rothstein's guidance, Luciano quickly rose through the ranks and became New York's top bootlegger. Luciano's criminal empire extended beyond bootlegging. He was involved in the production and importation of alcohol, working closely with other Prohibition-rich associates such as Meyer Lansky, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Louis Lepke Buckhalter, and Abe Longy Zwillman. Together, they formed a powerful network that controlled various aspects of the illegal alcohol trade. Luciano's rise to power was not without its challenges. In 1930, a conflict known as the Castellamarese War erupted in New York's Italian community. Luciano, drawn to the flexibility and inclusiveness of Salvatore Maranzano's camp, switched sides, leading to a power struggle between Maranzano and the old-school boss, Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masseria. In April 1931, fearing that Masseria was planning to kill him, Luciano arranged for the death of his longtime boss. 5 months later, Luciano had Maranzano killed, solidifying his position as the undisputed leader of the New York Mafia. Rejecting the traditional boss of bosses role, Luciano established the Commission, an organization that brought together crime family chiefs from across the nation to settle disputes and make consensus decisions. Meanwhile, in Chicago, another infamous gangster was making his mark: Al Capone. When Chicago outfit boss Johnny Torrio quit and turned control over to Capone after the violent beer wars in 1925, Capone was only 26 years old. Capone's criminal operation reached unprecedented heights, with an estimated revenue of $100 million in the late 1920s. Capone's empire extended far beyond bootlegging. He controlled speakeasies, breweries, gambling operations, prostitution rings, and other illicit activities. His powerful cohorts, such as Paul the Waiter Rica and Murray the Camel Humphreys, negotiated deals with Chicago and Illinois politicians, ensuring smooth operations and protection from law enforcement. However, Capone's reign of power would not go unchallenged. In 1929, 7 of Capone's rival gangster George Bugs Moran's associates were brutally gunned down in the infamous St. Valentine's Day massacre. Although Capone was suspected of orchestrating the massacre, he was never charged. The shocking event further eroded national support for Prohibition and drew the attention of federal authorities. The downfall of both Luciano and Capone would come through the legal system. In Luciano's case, his involvement in prostitution rackets eventually led to convictions and imprisonment in the 1930s. Capone, on the other hand, was convicted of federal income tax evasion in 1931 and sentenced to 11 years in prison. With the imprisonment of these two powerful figures, the era of Prohibition began to wane. The illegal alcohol trade was no longer as profitable, and organized crime had to adapt to new illicit activities. However, the legacy of Luciano and Capone would forever be etched in the annals of American criminal history. Let's take a closer look at the early history of alcohol consumption in colonial America and the rise of the temperance movement, the road that led to Prohibition. It all began in the early 17th century when the Puritans, among the first European colonists, arrived on the east coast of America. Along with their strict religious beliefs, they brought with them caches of beer and wine. These alcoholic beverages were considered essential for their survival in the New World. However, as the colonies grew, so did the drinking problem. By the early 18th century, colonial America was already facing issues with excessive alcohol consumption. The British Parliament, alarmed by the abuse of rum and brandy in Georgia, attempted to prohibit the transport of spirits into the colony in 1730. Ironically, just like the Prohibition that would come nearly 2 centuries later, this prohibition in Georgia lasted for 13 years. But the colonists found ways around it, turning to illegal stills and importing liquor from neighboring South Carolina. Commercial distillers of rum and whiskey also thrived in the years before and after the Revolutionary War. Even some of the founding fathers, such as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, were home brewers. Taverns, often the best locations for social and political communication, proliferated across the colonies. However, as the 19th century dawned, heavy drinking became the norm among American men. The average adult male was consuming anywhere from 7 to 12 gallons of alcohol per year. Concerns about the negative effects of hard liquor on society began to emerge. In 1811, former President John Adams declared his zeal amounting to enthusiasm against the spread of hard liquor in taverns. Organizations like the Massachusetts Society for the Suppression of Intemperance were formed in 1814 to protest excessive drinking. Similar groups soon followed in Connecticut and New York. President Andrew Jackson, Secretary of War, even eliminated the rations of whiskey given to soldiers in the U.S. Army and banned drinking at military installations. The Washingtonian movement, a group of drinkers in Baltimore, started in 1840, asking others to join in pledging to abstain from alcohol. Even a young Abraham Lincoln, in his temperance speech in 1842, praised the splendid success of campaigns to cut alcohol consumption. However, he also called for understanding and support for longtime drinkers, asking for a drop of honey and moral support instead of condemnation. The temperance movement gained momentum in the years after the Civil War, particularly among women who were the wives of middle and upper-class professional men. They blamed drinking for domestic violence and financial problems in the home. In 1873, in Hillsboro, Ohio, a woman named Eliza Mother Thompson, inspired by Dr. Diocletian Lewis, began organizing groups of hymn-singing women to enter stores and saloons, successfully urging many owners to stop selling booze. This campaign quickly caught fire, and temperance advocates managed to halt alcohol sales in parts of the Midwest and West. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, a protest and lobbying organization, was founded in 1874 and was headed by Frances Willard. The WCTU spoke of a national ban on alcohol and also played a significant role in promoting women's suffrage. However, the political successes of the temperance movement were hindered by the lobbying power of the moneyed liquor companies. These companies even blocked efforts to extend voting rights for women, fearing that they would vote in favor of prohibition. The stage was set for a larger shift in the path toward prohibition, which would come in 1893 with the founding of the Anti-Saloon League. This prohibitionist group, headed by Wayne Wheeler, proved to be a shrewd and ruthless political tactician. The Anti-Saloon League emerged during the Progressive Era, a period of significant reforms in civil rights, labor, conservation, industry, and political political corruption. Wheeler capitalized on the anti-immigrant sentiment of the time, inducing fear among mainly rural white Americans that the drinking cultures of new arrivals from Europe in urban areas were weakening the nation's moral fiber. Wheeler's success began in Ohio, where he managed to get dry legislators elected. By 1908, more than 50 counties in Ohio had opted to ban alcohol. Wheeler realized that national prohibition was within his grasp. As America entered World War I after declaring war on Germany in April 1917, the prohibitionists saw an opportunity to advance their cause. Led by Wayne Wheeler and his alliance of women's temperance bands, such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union and Protestant church groups, they set their sights on a constitutional amendment that would ban most alcohol. Wheeler and his crew became a powerful national political force, exploiting patriotism, resentment against German-American beer makers, and the desire to protect U.S. troops from the temptations of liquor and saloons. Their first major triumph was convincing Congress to approve wartime prohibition, a ban on alcohol for the duration of the war. With the momentum on their side, the dry activists proposed a prohibition amendment to Congress. They planned to lobby the state legislatures to approve its passage. On August 19, 1917, the U.S. Senate voted 65-20 in favor of the proposed 18th Amendment. The House of Representatives followed suit, with a favorable vote of 282-128 on December 18, 1917. Mississippi's legislature became the first of the 36 states required to ratify the amendment for inclusion in the Constitution, doing so on January 18, 1918. The nation's war debt had climbed toward 100,000 by the time voters went to the polls on November 5, 1918, for a midterm election for local, state, and national candidates. Just days after the election, on November 11, 1918, the armistice ending World War I was signed. With the war over and nativist anti-immigrant sentiment in the air, the prohibitionists rode the momentum. Weeks later, on January 16, 1919, the 18th Amendment became law after the 36th state legislature, Utah, ratified it. The amendment was set to take effect exactly 1 year later. But before prohibition could be fully implemented, Congress had to pass a federal statute to enforce the 18th Amendment. This statute would provide a legal process for banning the sales, distribution, and transportation of alcohol with an alcohol content of no more than 0.5%. It would also establish a bureau of federal agents to enforce the law. The man tasked with drafting this law was none other than Wayne Wheeler himself. He meticulously crafted the entire legislation, known as the National Prohibition Act. However, it would soon become better known as the Volstead Act, named after Representative Andrew Volstead, a Minnesota Republican and chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, who led the effort to pass it. Congress approved the Volstead Act in July, despite President Wilson's opposition. Lawmakers overrode his veto in October, solidifying the nation's commitment to prohibition. And so, on January 17, 1920, prohibition officially commenced in the United States. Violations of the law could result in fines of up to $1,000 and months behind bars. America's disastrous 13-year prohibition era had begun. The impact of prohibition on American society and culture was profound. It gave rise to a thriving underground market for illegal alcohol, led to the growth of organized crime, and sparked a wave of speakeasies and secret drinking establishments. But it also had unintended consequences, such as the loss of tax revenue, the rise of dangerous homemade alcohol, and the erosion of respect for the law. Prohibition would ultimately prove to be a failed experiment. In 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified, repealing the 18th Amendment and bringing an end to prohibition. If you enjoyed this video, click on the card showing on your screen right now for more videos.